Good morning, Breakfast with Bacon fans. So I've talked a lot about health. Those of you that know me know that I really tried to care for this temple of the Holy Spirit. But the man that you're looking at here has written a book about you really are that temple. Please know that this is not just your show about, diet and eat right. This doctor has spent this time really developing the spiritual elements of why your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit and what we need to do really morally to keep our bodies in the shape that we're supposed to. But he's not this suave, sophisticated guy you're looking at the whole time. He actually had to work to get to where he is. Don't mind my humor there, Dr. Vost. But Dr. Kevin Vost is my guest today. He is the author of You Are That Temple. It is a Catholic guide to health and holiness. Did I say that tagline right, Dr. Vost?
I believe you did. Thank you.
I did it. I did it. I'm not looking at it, so it's all coming out of my head. Thank you so much for coming on to the Breakfast with Bacon show. I'm really honored to have you.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I always loved every opportunity to talk about this topic.
Yeah, why this topic? Because you have your PhD in psychology, and then you're really connecting. This is what, your 27th book?
Yes, I believe so.
27. Mm-hmm. Good for you. It shows how healthy you are. But why this topic? Why is a psychologist or someone who's got the degree go into your health?
Yeah, well, good question. I think there's kind of three main areas in my life that have tied in to this book. And one is my background in psychology, particularly clinical psychology and neuropsychology. So my doctoral work was at the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, the neurology department, their Alzheimer's Center. So I was involved when testing people at the end of their lifespan, both people with dementias, other kinds of brain injuries, also normal volunteer elderly people who would come in so we could see what's normal for cognitive function as you go get, this is decades stack up. So I was always interested in that, our mental functioning. I also did college teaching part-time for over a decade, and I usually taught developmental psychology courses there, which included lifespan, they called it from womb to tomb, psychology of adolescence, and then psychology of aging as well. So in the book, I do talk on topics that are relevant to us throughout the lifespan. So I have my mindset is thinking in those terms, how these different concepts would apply to people of different ages. Now, then also from the time I was in second grade, I've been a weightlifter. I remember seeing a guy on TV lifting weights over his head, and I demanded that my dad get me some barbells. So he did. And when I was in second grade, and I played with him for a few years, but by about the seventh grade, I was working out regularly. So it's almost 50 years now.
Wow.
And I would compete in Olympic lifting and weightlifting and bodybuilding. And when I went through college, I worked as a weightlifting instructor. In fact, my wife of 38 years was one of my pupils way back in the day. So also taking care of your body had always been a big part of my interest and ongoing interest. And then there's a third area. My main occupation from 1984 to 2016 was doing mental and physical disability claims for the Social Security Administration on both children and adults. So I would look at the complete medical records of maybe 500 to 700 people every year as we made these decisions, along with some medical doctors and psychologists and other health professionals. So one thing I address in the book is that we've had some of these chronic health epidemics that are recent. Yeah. Obesity, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, things like that. And it occurred to me that I was kind of on the front lines right as these became epidemics. I saw them grow, through those decades. There's this kind of that confluence of three things: my interest in psychology and weightlifting and the disability, in addition to my love for Jesus Christ and the Catholic faith. I was raised Catholic, read the wrong kind of philosophers in my late teens, spent 25 years as an atheist. And then in my early 40s, the guidance of the Holy Spirit and the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas pulled me back to Christ and the church. So since that time, all these books I've written, they've all in one way or another kind of trying to expand and share a lot of wisdom that is contained within the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. And within those writings, he even has a lot of concepts that are relevant to take care of our body as well as our soul.
I mean, I could do a whole show just talking about, what does Aquinas himself have to say about the body itself. But I always like Dr. Vost. I love these when I teach classes and I talk about the research I've done on marriage and things, so whenever you have good research, science and faith always line up 100%. God didn't miss any details. God talked about our bodies, and God talked about, again, the temple of the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit, if we can just really talk about that, the Ark of the Covenant was so sacred that no one was allowed to touch it. The temple that they built in Jerusalem was so sacred that not even all the priests could go into the Holy of Holies. And I was talking to a priest friend of mine. He said the priest who drew straws and got to go in for that time, that month, whatever it was, they even used to put a rope around him in case he'd like die or pass out and he didn't come out for quite some time to kind of pull his body up, because even they knew that you don't go in there. So if we can keep this picture of how holy the temple is, then when you made these applications to this temple, you are the temple. And that should really make a lot of us, any jokes aside, any just like diet aside, we will have to answer to God for how we took care of our physical mind, our physical body, our physical health, our psychological. And so your book, You Are That Temple, was like a newer way for me to see people address that epidemic that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, one, Christine, I love that imagery you have of the Holy of the Holies in the temple and pulling him out with a rope. That's not in the book, but I love it. So yeah, it should reframe the way we think about our own bodies, because that title, You Are That Temple, I'm borrowing directly from St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and then again in chapter 6. And he says, do you not know that your body is a temple of God's Holy Spirit? He says, that temple you are, so glorify God in your body. And then, my main man, St. Thomas Aquinas, elaborates centuries later. He said, too, when Jesus told us to love God with all we are and our neighbor as ourself, when he's telling us to love ourself, he's saying we love ourself body and soul, because God crafted us as both. And in fact, we know the church teaches that when Jesus comes again after the second judgment, we're going to be embodied souls throughout eternity, hopefully up in heaven with these beautiful glorified bodies. So yes, Scripture in the church is always taught the sacredness of our body. So yes, it would heed us well to try to be good stewards, to show God gratitude for these wonderful gifts by trying to keep the bodies, as healthy and fit as we can, as long as we're also then, following the other important things we need to do in our lives. We're not becoming, of course, obsessed with bodily care at the expense of other things, but a proper measure, a proper tending of our temple is really what God calls for from all of us.
Yeah, I love that too, because, another thing, we'll kind of stick with the Catholic or the holiness part here for a minute before we kind of cross on to, what do you find and how do we do this? Is I did talk, because you just alluded to it, is another priest has said, well, a couple priests, I've heard them say, do you know how in all my years of the priesthood in confessions, I've almost never heard anybody confess gluttony or sloth. And yet Dr. Vost.
Yeah, Vost.
Vost.
I mean, long O.
Okay. So you think about the 7 deadly sins. They're not named that because, well, let's just pick 7 things. Those are deadly, gluttony and sloth, just like anger, avarice and lust. And some of the really big things that we think about, it's like, well, that's lust, but at least, I'm not being a glutton, but I'm not. And, you're really putting these thoughts in my head that God is going to make us answer. And again, our God is not a punishing God. He's a just God. He's merciful, but he is going to say, why did you sit? Why didn't you take care of that temple? Why did you overeat? Why did you waste food? Why didn't you care for this thing, this body I gave you to drag around this temple for your lifetime? Why? And so when we really think about those, and that kind of makes, that's what I want my viewers to watch. That's the seriousness of our health. And as you have in your book, the guide to health and holiness. So tell me how to be holier.
Okay, well, one, I mean, with the comments on gluttony, that is very important. There's a quote from Pope St. Gregory the Great that said, if you haven't begun to stand up to gluttony, you really haven't begun to begin the spiritual battle, because it kind of starts with the proper care of our body. And Thomas Aquinas writes about different varieties of gluttony. We typically think that eating too much, but you mentioned other things like wasting your food, or Thomas would say being a finicky eater, demanding only gourmet foods, not having not having respect for the simple fare, foods as God made them, or for eating too often, from not being able to observe fast. So there can be, a lot of dimensions of gluttony. But another point I make in the book is not to say that if a person is of large body type, they're not necessarily, mired in the sin of gluttony. Different ones have different genetics that lean towards being thin or more muscular or heavier. The mesomorph, ectomorph, endomorph
Right.
thing. Those are real. But a point I try to make in the book is partly because of how we've been told to eat in the last several decades, which has been very carbohydrate heavy, very sugar heavy, things like that. It tends to make a lot of people very, very hungry.
Sluggish. Oh, yeah.
Sluggish, or it would be both. Yes, it tends to make you hungrier because you're not feeding the body the nutrients it needs. So you need to take in more foodstuffs to reach those nutrients. And then also, it's making you feel sluggish. So when we tell people, you just need to eat less and move more, sometimes the kind of foods that people are eating make it hard for them to eat less because they're always hungry and they don't feel like moving more because they're always tired. And part of that's because their blood sugar is going all over the place. So one of the lessons I try to do in the nutritional part of the book is saying, if we can alter the way we eat to move it more along terms of real foods as God made them, we might find it a lot easier to curb our gluttony. Because our body's own physiology, the way God made us, is going to kind of come to our aid by establishing normal hunger patterns. So maybe we will be able to eat simpler foods, healthier foods, and not feel like we have to eat, multiple times throughout the day.
Yeah, there's a billion things that I wanted to ask you, but I keep in my mind, so I hope this doesn't sound like I'm going off track, but I keep coming to fasting, and you mentioned fasting for a minute. So is there a value? I know there's a value spiritually to fasting, but the physical values. So can you kind of really quickly touch on the values? How does fasting make you healthier and holier physically and spiritually?
Yeah, well, all time within our Catholic tradition, we've recognized the value of fasting, and it goes back to the Jewish tradition before that. Of course, we know that Jesus fasted up to 40 days, and it helps us to control our bodily urges, to conquer our gluttony, things like that. It helps to focus our awareness more on God. We've long known a variety of spiritual benefits and also medical benefits. Go back like to Hippocrates, the Greek, one of the fathers of medicine. Fasting was in the arsenal there for certain medical problems. You're going to abstain from eating. And we probably all have the natural reflex. If we got a stomach flu or something, the last thing we want to do is eat. Yeah. So there can be, fasting can be helpful, allow our body to heal. Now, I will say too, in recent years in the health world, there's been a lot of attention now to fasting and what's called intermittent fasting.
Yeah, what about
time restricted eating? And I'll just say from my own background, as a weightlifter, as a bodybuilder, who was involved in the mainstream nutritional advice for decades, I always looked down on that because I was taught, you want to be as big and strong as possible, you got to be constantly fueling that machine, keep that protein pumping in every few hours or so. So I was really skeptical, but in the last few years, my views have changed on this. The old advice used to be probably from some of our moms and grandmas was, eat 3 square meals a day and don't snack. And research shows that up to the 1960s or even into the 70s, people did tend to eat about 3 meals a day. Then as our dietary advice changed, people were advised to eat more frequently, include some planned snacks, maybe eat 5 or 6 times a day. And since that time, though, our obesity rates have really, really gone high. Mm-hmm. And there may be certain people with certain characteristics that do need to eat multiple times a day. But for most of us, we probably will find that we don't have to. And part of the problem is, we know that when we eat, especially carbohydrates, to some extent protein and just a tiny bit fat, it tends to raise our blood sugar. Then our pancreas puts out insulin, which decreases our blood sugar. And if we're eating all the time, we're kind of always on a roller coaster where our blood sugar and our energy levels are rising up and down. But if we go longer periods between eating, then in a sense, our metabolisms have a time to rest. Our blood sugar has a chance to stabilize, and it tends to have some positive health benefits. So some people will, it varies how a person will fast. Myself, I mainly just use a mild version of time-restricted eating. I will eating about 5:30 p.m. each night, and then I won't eat again until the next morning, maybe 7:30 or so after I've had a morning workout. So about a 14-hour window. And then I would usually just eat 3 meals a day or occasionally skip a lunch and have just 2. And I personally found that has had no negative impact whatsoever on my workout ability, on my strength. And I just feel better that way, less bloating. So there's all kinds of benefits that some people will find if they can restrict the timing of their meals or the frequency of their meals. And again, if they eat more natural foods as God made them, more natural things around the outside of the grocery store, your natural proteins through meat and fish and chicken, your eggs, your fruits and vegetables, it also then becomes easier to go longer periods between meals when the meals you eat are actually nourishing your body.
Yes, yes, yes. I actually just heard a podcast last month, and they talked about something. No, so I fast frequently. I never used to, but I do. And again, instead of feeling weak, I feel clear-headed. And they talked about too, when you eat, the brain has to send blood down to the stomach. And when it's in the stomach, it's not in the brain. It's not in the other places. And so they talked about, and they were actually talking about spiritual fasting as well. The values of fasting spiritually is that you are so much more clear-headed, that you can make better decisions. And then Dr. Vost, I think too, in terms of spiritual warfare, I mean, let's just go there, what we're dealing with right now. One of the things I teach clients in my own profession, and I'm a healthy person. I run 6 miles a day, but that's not what I train people on. I'm see myself as a very fit 58-year-old, but I also talk about the powerful spiritual warfare battles of fasting, that when you when you weaken your body, and not your body, I don't want to be weak, but when I weaken the flesh's pull on my spirit, I strengthen the spirit's pull on the flesh. So does Aquinas or any of your theologians or doctors of the church talk about that, the power of the spiritual warfare that fasting is?
Yeah, and that's not a theme I personally emphasize in the book, but they certainly have. Oh yeah, fasting is a powerful spiritual weapon, and I think there too, because we're mind, body, and soul, and there is that impact that it can make your thinking actually clearer. And I will note in my own case, I've lifted weights for 50 years now, but I've only really modified my diet significantly the last 2 years to include things like fasting. And I recall it used to be, if I was going to give a talk or something like, oh, when did I last eat? I have to make sure there's something in me within a couple hours. Now I don't mind if there's multiple hours before I do an interview or talk or something, because I am fresher. So one thing in that mind-body unity, that fasting is going to have positive effects on our brain. Our brains aren't being bogged by the up and down blood sugar levels. You're running more off of ketones and things generated from fats in your body. So when we can think more clearly, and our cognition is crisper, we're also in a much better position to meditate, to pray to God, to speak to God, to meditate upon spiritual things. And we're going to be less susceptible to the temptations of the devil and the demons. They can't make our choices for us, but they can tempt us. Yeah. And if we're in a state where we're distracted, where we're bogged down, where we're not at our best, they're going to have an easier time making a foothold than in a case when, we've tampered down our flesh and strengthened our spirit. And fasting, is definitely one way that can help us do that.
So let's do something tangible. So I know, just, as example, one of the things that you talk about in your book, that people have like joint pain, and then you offer like alternate fitness routines and things like that. Does your food change that? Like, I know my husband deals with joint pain. So like, that's one example. So in this book, when people get it, will they see, wow, if I change my eating, I'll change something like joint pain? It's just one example.
Yes, I think very, very possibly so. And I do include a chapter with like over 60 references of particular books on particular areas, and some might dig more into those. But yes, they're like for joint pain, there are things like inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or gout, where we actually see inflammation. The joints might become red and swollen. So if you're changing your diet in such a way that you have less inflammation, that's going to ease. So many people do report when they're cleaning up the diet from the ultra processed foods, excess simple carbohydrates, they often feel that their autoimmune type conditions have improved. Their joints feel much better. And some people even report with things like degenerative arthritis, which is seen as like just a breakdown of tissue, wear and tear over time. Often people with that kind of arthritis too will say that they feel better because there's some level of inflammation involved there too. So in fact, too, some people who will eat this way, will have a significant weight loss. And they'll say, boy, my knees don't hurt as much now. Well, yeah, one, they're not carrying around as much weight as they used to. And two, then you may also have this anti-inflammatory effect. So it's a very potential double whammy. Your joints feel better because they're not carrying the burden they used to, and because your internal state is healthier, there's less inflammation. So I know from my own case and from many other people I've read about and have spoken to, that is not at all unusual for people to report a decrease in joint pain when they, eat more natural foods, decrease the inflammatory foods, and when they're sure to exercise in ways that are compatible with their own body. Like weightlifters, many of us over years, we develop certain injuries, and we realize this used to be my favorite exercise. I can't do that one anymore, but I'm going to find one that I can do. So I think that's another important thing too, to do the kind of exercise that fits your body at this particular stage in your life.
Yeah. So what do you say to people, and I know this is all out there, and I want to hear your opinion, like as you're getting older, 50, 60, 70, weightlifting, muscle building. What do you say on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a lifelong lifter, so I've always enjoyed it and tried to keep my strength up. I remember when I turned 60 a couple of years ago, I deadlifted 410 pounds for 5 repetitions just to see what I could still do, because it still
you rock. That's awesome. And what does it do to your mind too?
Yeah, it feels good because I will say, in most areas, I was a competitive weightlifter in my early 20s, and I'm not as strong as that now. But at 62, I'm pretty much as strong as I was any time in my 40s or in my 50s. In fact, I think I'm in better health now in my 60s because I'm at least just as strong, but I usually weigh 25 pounds less than I did when I was younger and stronger. Yeah. So for most of us, as long as our joints are in shape, studies show that even people into their 80s, our muscles can respond pretty much like they used to stimulus. They can still grow in size and strength through the proper kinds of training, as long as we don't damage our joints. But also a lot of research out there showing that as we get older, many of us tend to develop what's called anabolic resistance. Our bodies may not synthesize tissue from protein as easily as we used to. So there's some recommendations out there that especially athletic people may want to consider increasing their protein intake as they get older, just to make sure those muscles are properly fed so they can, maintain their size and strength. Because too, and it's not just a vanity thing, there's a lot of research out there showing that people tend to live longer and are more functional at later ages by keeping up muscle mass and muscle strength. Even something as simple as measures of a person's grip strength has been found for decades to be a robust predictor of longevity and functionality later in life. So yeah, it's important to keep up muscle strength, and we can, if we're careful, to find ways to do it without causing harm to our joints.
And if we believe it's possible, I get so tired of hearing, well, I'm older and I can't. I'm like, no, then you start out with lower weights and then you get back up. It's just, the endorphins and the mental health and the good things you feel. It's really funny that you talked about the meat too, because my whole life, if I'd go to a party, I always went straight to the vegetable tray because I love the taste of vegetables. I mean, I've always been, relatively thin, so I never had to worry about it, but my body craved vegetables, which I still do. But I tell you, at 58, now I'm a marathon runner, mostly half marathons, and I love my half Ironman triathlons. I love that stuff. Wow. But I have been finding that I will get to this point where I will scratch somebody's eyes out if I don't get red meat. You know what I mean? I'm joking. Don't really scratch your eyes out, but it's like my husband.
Well, I understand the feeling though.
We need to go. I need a steak. Chicken's not going to, I just need a steak. So are you saying that there's a correlation then, not just to my physical my fitness routine, but also to age and fitness, or did I mishear that?
Yeah, no, that would be true too. And another message I try to get throughout the book is, if we're kind of going back to the way people used to eat, according to the nature, the foods that God made for us, meat and eggs and plants, fruits and vegetables and things, instead of the more than 2/3 of ultra processed foods that our children now, ages 2 to 18, 67% of their daily intake comes from these fake artificial foods. But yeah, the research is showing that, especially too, as we get older, these real foods are going to feed our bodies with what we need. Now, myself, I'm also a huge fan of red meat. I've got some sirloin steaks right now sitting in the fridge, and usually about every other night, actually, now I have sirloin or ribeye or New York strip or filet or something like that. But yes, for decades too, I believe personally, and based on a lot of research I've read recently, that red meat has kind of been demonized.
Right?
And people may not be aware of this, but even
Like,
like
oh,
the
chicken
American,
and pork, the other white meat.
that's right. Even the American Cardiology Association review just a few years back said, hey, basically we've missed the boat. We should not necessarily be worried about saturated fat that comes from these natural animal sources in terms of risk for heart disease. So I will say too, these last 2 years I've been eating this way. I just had my annual physical a few weeks ago, and my blood levels were great. Years ago, when I was eating by the food pyramid, at one point I was prescribed a statin, a medicine for cholesterol, which I took and had bad side effects and stopped. Well, eating this way, including a lot of red meat, a lot of eggs, I had the best blood levels I've ever had. Your triglycerides are supposed to be under 40, and mine were 88. HDL for men is supposed to be over 40, and mine had gone up to 55. Just all my values were really good, and there was no indication for any statin, even though I'm eating this relatively high meat and egg diet. So yeah, I think, it's some of it's detailed in the book, but most of these foods, well, one thing I think you got to question the wisdom of saying that foods that we've eaten since Adam and Eve, that these are causing new epidemics. It seems unlikely.
Right. This is what I love about your book, because you're taking body, mind, and spirit, and you're taking in a very real, very powerful, and not this wishy-washy, oh, love God and take care of your temple. And you got, anyway, you're integrating. Like, one thing I want to talk about is where it says you in your book, and I want, my viewers to know this, you cultivate moral, intellectual, theological virtues, makes your body a holy temple. I mean, that is, you're going to the richness of diet and anything God gives us, the food God gives us, and not the stuff that we've messed up. But how do we, you're kind of going there, but I want to be real specific then. Like, why would cultivating my moral or my intellectual or my theological virtues, why will that make my body a holy temple? Do we address that, or can you be more specific?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And this is again where I borrow heavily from St. Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas, commenting on what Aristotle said before him, said basically, as health and beauty and fitness are to the body, so too are virtues to the soul. So basically there's a parallel. Virtues are perfections of our spiritual powers. Health and beauty and fitness are perfections of the physical capacities and powers that God gave us. So there's a real parallel there. So for example, in terms of the 4 cardinal moral virtues, there's lots of moral virtues, but 4 we call cardinal or essential. Right. And one is fortitude. Sometimes it's called courage as well. Right. But Thomas says fortitude basically has 2 main components. Through fortitude, we overcome difficult obstacles, or we endure difficulties that may be ongoing, So I say fortitude, okay, overcoming difficult obstacles, enduring. Well, overcoming difficult obstacles, that's me in the gym. That's my goal anyway. That's weightlifting, in a physical application of this. I'm going to try to literally overcome difficult obstacles. Well, what about, okay, let's look at your realm of the distance running. Boy, talk about enduring things that are not easy. And Thomas actually says the principal act of fortitude is to endure. So we can look at that cardinal virtue of fortitude that enables us to do difficult things, for the greater glory of God. And we can also apply that. Well, that's how I'm going to apply that to my body as well. That's how I'm going to do things that aren't easy, because I know they're good for me, because I'm showing gratitude to God by doing that. And then briefly, the second cardinal virtue is temperance or self-control. So we can see how that, of course, fits in with what we eat. Are we controlling ourselves so we eat the things that God made that really make us healthy? And it doesn't mean we can't have joy in our diet. We should find pleasure in the things that we eat.
I have ice cream frequently.
Yeah, ice cream. Yeah, and my thing, my version of ice cream is I have these whey or casein protein shakes that with milk, and they're flavored, so they taste a lot like a milkshake. So I'm with you there. But temperance there.
Dark chocolate. Tell me this isn't a sin.
I don't know if it's a sin or not, but if it is a sin, I share with you.
But
I like what you show me. I don't know how you do it, but when I do dark chocolate, that's what I want. I want, ideally, one little piece in a package.
That's it. I don't need a big, and actually if I eat like a whole candy bar or something, I'm like, but this is enough to just, And so, the word to discipline comes from the word disciple, which means to guide or to teach. And when we discipline our bodies, when we discipline our minds, we are guiding and teaching. And, so there's a really good that understanding to discipline oneself. You're guiding yourself in the way of God, and you're teaching yourself what you should and should not do. And so physically, it's what you're doing. But yeah, if I'm only physically training my body, but I'm not spiritually training myself, that we're lopsided, or vice versa. If I'm this really holy spiritual, I'm in church all the time, I'm doing adoration, but I'm gluttonous, and I'm 300 pounds, then that's also unbalanced. So no judgment from me or you on anybody watching this show, because we are two sinners right here. But we just want all of you to know is we got to work to balance it. And that's why this book, you guys got to get your hands on this book, because it's written in such a refreshing way, addressing areas that most health books don't. That's really what I like about it, So how can people get their hands on this book?
Well, the book is from Sophia Institute Press, so their website is sophiainstitute.com. I will say that if a viewer or listener has a local Catholic bookstore, that can be a good place to go. They may have it or be able to get it. And then, of course, it's also going to be available on most of your internet online sellers.
Yeah, you can get them everywhere. But if you can, I've been doing interviews for Sophia Institute because it's a Catholic publisher. So maybe it's $1 or $2 more, maybe not. Maybe it's the same price, you have to pay shipping. But always, if you can, give the money to the church organizations, because it's the church. So if people want to get a hold of you, do you open yourself up to people talking specifically about issues, or is that something that you don't want?
Oh, no, I don't mind at all. I mean, I don't do this, in a formal way for payment or anything, but I have a website, drvost.com, just drvost.com. I don't particularly keep it particularly updated, but there is a comment box on the bottom. So if a person had a comment or a question for me, just pop it in there and I will respond.
Yeah, that is excellent, especially for those of you, seeking to draw closer to God and merge this body, mind, spirit together. I would highly suggest this book, and I'd highly suggest Dr. Vost as well. And again, the title of the book is You Are That Temple. You Are That Temple, a Catholic Guide to Health and Holiness. And if you're watching and you're not Catholic, it's still a great book for anyone that's seeking to cultivate the virtues and become closer to God. And so I would argue you should get this, and it's easy reading. Not when they hear PhD, they think everything's going to be so intellectually heady that it's hard to understand, but it's not. It's very easy reading, but it's rich. And that's what I like about it. So, Dr. Vost, I appreciate you coming on the show. Just curious, did you ever have to lose a lot of weight? I know you mentioned in the book that you came to a period where you had to kind of pull it together, and then you started building. Was that back when you were a youth, or since then have you had a struggle?
Yeah, no, just in brief, I'm about 5'9", 5'9.5", and I used to compete in weightlifting in my 20s in the 198-pound class. I usually weighed about 200. The heaviest I've ever been in my adult life was 234 when I was doing nothing but powerlifting in my early 40s. In my mid 40s, I got into some distance running myself in a fairly big way, like up to half marathons. I remember I got down to 170 pounds. But then through my late 50s, I usually hung at about 220 pounds, which was, over 20 pounds more than my younger competitive weight. And it wasn't until 2 years ago when I turned 60, like a week or two after, it's almost exactly 2 years now, that I altered my diet and dropped 30 pounds from 220 to 190. So even though I was lifting and working out all those years, it was changing the diet that caused that drop. And it also then led to over a 20-point drop in blood pressure, to a loss of no more gastrointestinal or gastroesophageal reflux.
Right.
None of this. So yeah, I was never, grossly obese, though my body weight was in the obese category. But just mainly by making these simple dietary changes, it just had a huge impact in my own health, even though I've exercised throughout my life.
Wow. Well, I'm so grateful that you came on. I would love everyone to get a copy of this book, and maybe we'll get you on and talk about some of those other books that you've written. But for all of you, go to sophiainstitute.com and you can get a copy of this book, You Are That Temple, by Dr. Kevin Vost. And if you know someone in your life that maybe could hear the message, but they don't want to hear it from you, it's really good to put something like this in their hands. And of course, I'd like you to follow me as well. Go to breakfastwithbacon.com and like me, please, on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all those, Rumble, all those social media places. It does help when you like and getting the words out. And then when God sends me guests like this, it gets out to more and more people. So drchristinebacon.com or breakfastwithbacon.com. I am always trying to win souls for Christ, and talking about health and holiness is one of the ways to do that. So Dr. Vost, I forgot to tell you how I go off the air. So I'm going to give you a cue, and the words are kind of like health, right? Just remember sunny side up. Okay. That's because eggs, you eat them that way, right? So when I point, you have to say sunny side up. Okay. So to all of you watching, I am very appreciative. Please come back and peruse my website or YouTube and check out all the other amazing guests God has given me. But until then, I'm Dr. Christine Bacon. You've been watching Breakfast with Bacon, and I'd like to remind you always to live your life
Sunny side up.
You did it.